Good morning, everyone. This is Jim Morris speaking. Thank you for joining this webinar on pharmaceutical quality systems, and specifically the topic is unlocking the value of the pharmaceutical quality system. As I mentioned, this is a recorded webinar, and there will be time at the end for some Q&A. So if you would save your questions to the end, and you would submit those via the chat feature. Just a few words about myself before we get into the content of this 30-minute webinar. My name is Jim Morris. I'm happy to host this webinar. I'm with NSF Health Sciences and have been working in the pharmaceutical industry going on 30 years. I've worked with 4 different companies. Have always had roles in quality and manufacturing, close to plant operations, and in some cases close to corporate office roles. I've now been with NSF Health Sciences at NSF International going on about 9 years. I lead the excipient certification program for NSF International, and I also champion our training and education for our U.S.-based clients, in addition to carrying out audits, consulting, training, essentially the activities that's core to what we do at NSF. That's a little bit about me. I'm happy to host this. The agenda that we've got for this webinar is quite straightforward. We'll look at the evolution of the quality system, pharmaceutical quality system, essentially going back and taking a look back on 10 years. I'd like to offer some points related to how you could do a health check of your quality system and check the maturity of your system, and also provide some recommendations on how you can unlock the value of your pharmaceutical quality system. Often you may hear or you may feel that colleagues view the quality system as a burden, and what I'd like to do is put forward tips on how you can truly unlock the value so that feeling is not there. Towards the end, as I mentioned, there'll be a little bit of time that we can reserve for questions and hopefully some answers as well. So opening question for this webinar: which guideline has had the most impact on quality management systems in the pharma sector? I think most of you would probably quickly go to Q10 and the Q10, the Pharmaceutical Quality System, ICH Q10. This document, now almost 10 years since it was first put out, is truly a milestone, truly a landmark document for our industry, and it's essentially the focus of this webinar. Q10 set a high bar for us. It didn't really bring in new requirements, but rather augmented or enhanced GMPs while respecting regional requirements. As many of you can appreciate, it covers the entire life cycle, from development through to product discontinuation. It puts a lot of emphasis on the role of management and the expectations around management's commitment to the PQS. And it puts forward and emphasizes concepts related to the design of the PQS, which we'll touch on here in this webinar. It emphasizes continual improvement, the importance of process capability. It emphasizes the enablers, knowledge management, and the principles related to quality risk management. So there's a little bit of background. I'm sure that's just simply to put things in a frame. What we do know today is that staying put is not acceptable. That we cannot, we need to be continually improving our systems, and certainly management commitment is expected, and it's something that is quite clear and put forward in Q10. What's unique is that it really was looking at trying to assure that there was and that there is the ability to move products from development through to commercialization. So in many respects, these two objectives, looking at this from, say, a 10,000-foot view, were to take the PQS, and as many of you can appreciate, the PQS, the quality systems, are really, in many respects, supporting commercial operations. And with Q10 and this this guidance, it reaches back into development and essentially is intending to provide a strong link between development and commercial ops. And so much of the focus at its inception was to move away from a compliance-based approach, if you will, blind compliance, to assuring that products are developed in a manner so we have robust processes and reduce variability. So that's sort of the backdrop, as many of you can, I think, well appreciate. If we dig deeper into Q10, specifically around its objectives, they are, as noted here, to achieve product realization, to move products, deliver products, commercialize products in a compliant manner, to ensure a state of control, and to facilitate continual improvement. Now, if we look back, going on nearly 10 years since Q10 was put forward as a guidance in the U.S. and reached stage 4 through the ICH process, how do we look today? Taking a sort of a macro look at the industry as, if you will, industry report card. And I just took a stab at this. This is obviously very high level because you really do need to look at these three objectives at a corporate level, at a company level. But if we take a look at the industry as a whole and look at some important benchmarks, drug approvals are up. 2017 was a very important year in terms of drug approvals. The number of novel drugs reached a high of 46. If we go back across the 10 years, that's in the scope of when Q10 was first put out, drug approvals in 2008 were approximately 25. We've been averaging about 31, and last year the total number of novel new drugs, meaning new chemical entities or new biologics, reached a number of 46. So it's a record, and it says a lot about the development activity in the industry. When you think about the state of control, just taking a stab at a macro look, warning letters, you could say arguably and clearly warning letters are down year to year from 16 to 17. However, I think we can all appreciate that there's still a lot of work to be done, and that warning letter trends are still quite high. But if you look at the specific numbers from 16 to 17, you see a significant drop from 57 warning letters in 16 to 37 and 17 for pharma operations. And then taking a stab from a macro point of view at what we're doing related to continued improvement, and granted this should be viewed at the company level, but if we look at an industry as a whole, there are probably a number of measures that each of you would select. I chose Q12 and the development of Q12, as this will also be a landmark document when it's put into place in terms of managing post-approval activity. And the fact is that Q12 has reached step 2. It's in the common phase, and this will facilitate the management of change in our industry. So these are sort of big picture views of how we stand if we look back 10 years. Just a few more points on this. As we spend, as a consultancy, we spend a lot of time in companies in a variety of roles, remediating quality systems, improving quality systems, conducting audits, and so forth. And I think if we look back, and many of you hopefully would agree, that management role is quite a bit more clearly understood with regard to the PQS. There's clear evidence of management reviews at essentially all companies that I visit. And escalation mechanisms are in place through procedures and through essentially the way management is structured. There's also greater focus on continuous improvement. You see this evidenced by the approach to 2011 guidance on process validation, puts emphasis on the various stages, and specifically stage 3, the expectation that there be continued process verification, where you see some companies taking fairly novel approaches in how they're actually utilizing stage 3 to maintain a state of control and monitor processes. And you also see, in the context of continuous improvement, that companies have embedded effectiveness checks in their CAPA programs and in their change control systems. And that's a good thing, that we're looking to assure that these changes are effective, that CAPAs are effective, and they don't have any potentially negative consequences. So, of course, I would look at also the thumbs down side of things, and where is there room for improvement? But NSF, we've done a review of warning letters going back 5 years, the period 2013 to 2017, and these would be the most frequently cited FDA findings. These 5 points that are listed here, and it's probably no surprise to those of you on this call. And we also know that there's a huge amount of focus on data integrity lapses in companies, and investigation handling gets a lot of attention. So there's been great progress. I think it's noteworthy to point out the level of drug approvals, the fact that warning letters are hopefully moving favorably in a better direction. That there's a more embeddedness to quality systems in many respects, more involvement by management. Yet there's work to be done, as I'm sure we can all appreciate. So some points on the health check. Second item on the agenda is to essentially ask yourself the question, how robust are your systems? How healthy is your quality system? How mature are your systems? And there are different ways to look at this clearly. One is to take a look at the pillars, the PQS elements that are cited in Q10, which are these: process performance and quality monitoring, CAPAs, change management, and management review. And looking at these pillars, you can ask specific questions to assess the health of each of these elements. For instance, a simple question to ask is whether or not your annual product quality reviews are identifying opportunities for improvement. Often I'll be in a company and we'll look at annual product reviews, and sadly we'll see that many times what we see is a straightforward conclusion that the process is in a state of control. However, when you dig through the annual product review, you'll see some trends related to deviations, perhaps even complaints, some changes that have been put in place, and you have to question whether or not that's a strong statement, and that the process, whether or not there isn't ample room for improvement. I've seen some companies really take a proactive role. I mentioned earlier the use of continued process verification. And there is a company I've come across that is really looking at stage 3 very proactively and looking at process variability for particular products against the benchmark of products within that class, and determining whether or not that process variability for a particular product is in line with the benchmark. And where it's not, they're taking action. And that's feeding back to systems to look at what can be done to improve the process and reduce variability. Hopefully we see more of the latter. Under CAPAs, we can ask the question whether or not CAPAs are truly robust. And this is a key point. As I mentioned earlier, so the investigations is a key area of focus. And if we find in our companies that reoccurrence rates are in excess of 10%, and what we see frequently is that they're far in excess of 10%, sometimes even 20%, you have to ask the question whether or not investigations are driving the root cause, and whether CAPAs are truly focused on root cause and putting to bed issues. Reoccurrence rates is a real key variable, and companies that really zero in on this particular metric and try to drive it down are really looking to improve what they're doing, and the value that they can unleash in doing that is tremendous. If we look at the next pillar on change management, we can ask a number of questions. If you go to Q10, you'd see the emphasis on change management. But we can ask some fairly high-level questions and determine whether or not we're assuring regulatory compliance versus the design space. And as Reg Affairs is involved in change control approvals, and if it turns out that there's a weakness in this area, the maturity of our system, the health of our system is not good, because this could be truly a landmine if Reg Affairs is not involved when they should be in the change control process. We can also look at the pillar related to management review and determine whether or not management is truly monitoring the health effectiveness of the PQS, and importantly, whether or not management is taking action, or is this a checkbox exercise? What we want is that there's feedback, and that it links right back to the evaluation of process performance and product quality monitoring. And specifically, that management is looking at issues and looking to identify areas where perhaps training needs to be focused on, and perhaps there needs to be a focus on particular process improvements. What we don't want to see, and it would be an indicator that your system is not yet mature enough, if that management review is a cursory review. Another approach to evaluating the health of a company's PQS, and specifically the involvement of management, is to actually pull out the section of Q10 related to management commitment. I've done that here. These are the 7 points that are listed in Q10 related to management's commitment. You don't need to read through it. However, what is interesting is if you were to essentially put these forward and then self-assess, you see on the left the series of boxes with the heading scoring 1 to 10. If you were to self-assess how your management is doing relative to each of these points on management commitment, you would end up with some very interesting discussions. I've done this with senior groups and companies, and it's usually identified areas where management feels that additional work can be done, additional commitments can be made, if you will. And this is hugely complex in many companies that are multi-site, where you have a network of plants. Achieving this level of commitment across the network is not an easy task. And putting this forward to essentially self-assess how a company and a management team is doing is a worthy exercise, and will give you indicators of what you can do to further improve the maturity of your system. So I'd like to roll into the third point to cover on this webinar, and that's specifically around unlocking the value of the PQS. The first point that I'd like to raise is to right-size the quality system for development stage activity. Q10 was a landmark document because it takes the quality system, which perhaps was very focused on commercial activity, and it really reaches back now to development activity. So linking the two, very important to moving products through the pipeline and commercializing effectively. However, thinking back to my experience at where R&D was a heavy aspect of the oversight that I had, I can think back to my development colleagues, and they would move away from me when we started talking about nonconformances and deviations, changes, and there was sort of a reluctance to talk about and embrace the quality system. But what we need to do to overcome that to some degree is to right-size the PQS to support development stage activity appropriately. And Q10 provides us good guidance. It pulls out, for instance, under change control, how change control should satisfy the needs in development all the way through to product discontinuation. And implied is that we have a ramping up of the system such that when you get to manufacturing, from tech transfer to manufacturing, you would have a formal change management system in place with effectiveness checks, risk assessments, et cetera. And whereas earlier in development, you're capturing major changes. And importantly, as noted in the second bullet under development, you're documenting the change history, the development history of a product. So important for developing and managing the IND, and then assuring that the right information makes it into your CMC package. So Q10 offers us some guidance on how to leverage the PQS and to assure that we're moving products through development appropriately and managing change appropriately. And it clearly emphasizes the importance of applying risk-based principles whereby the level of effort and formality of a change evaluation would commensurate with the level of risk. In other words, if the change is a minor change, early stage development, say at phase 1, that perhaps has to do with something that's peripheral to the process, perhaps that would be classified as a minor change and can be managed in a fairly quick way, whereas changes that are more significant would warrant quite a bit more attention, quite a bit more evaluation, such as a change to a formulation, as an example. So this is what Q10 does for us related to this element of the change system of the PQS. But it's important that we dig further, and this is the recommendation I'd like to put forward, that you can take Q10, essentially proceduralize it for elements such as change control, and be very specific about what you're expecting at various phases of development. I've done this, and it works quite well, whereby when you get to phase 3, if you note in the second line, all process equipment changes would require change control. So you basically formalize things by phase 3. Clearly, when you've got a licensed product, changes are going through the typical change management procedures, and the CMC content drives the need for regulatory change notification. If you rewind back to phase 1, it's the big stuff that needs to be formalized through your change system, as I mentioned just a minute ago regarding the example of, say, formulation changes. And there's some examples here, such as new purification process and a new cell line. What you want to do is, or at least the recommendation is, to do this across your systems, such as the deviation system, such as batch record controls, and provide a bit of flexibility at early stages so things are captured, yet at the same time make sure things are being formalized at latter stages. And this is the first recommendation I'd like to put forward in terms of unlocking some of the value of your PQS. In development, there's tremendous value in doing this well, and so I want to emphasize that. The other is to take a look at the senior leadership's oversight of the PQS. And proactive management is called out in Q10. These are the specific points that are raised in Q10 related to management's review of the PQS and the health of the PQS. Under point B, there are 4 points that are listed, and I think most of you would be tracking these in your companies without question. So I'd say the vast majority of companies are doing exactly what's expected of senior leadership. However, what I'd like to put forward is the opportunity to look at the nature of reoccurring issues in companies. And I truly feel that this is an area where you really are mining for gold in terms of unlocking the value. To be more specific, you can look at your investigation and capital programs, look at your internal and external audit results, and specifically look at what people are saying at the shop floor level, where their level of risk awareness is. People will know where the potential landmines are. And where it's perceived that this quality system is weak, in other words, you're finding that your CAPAs are frequently going back to the training system or to the maintenance systems in place, or validation weaknesses. It indicates that there's persistent weakness with an element of the PQS, and that needs to be fed back to management reviews. And it needs to result in action. And the action plans would address those weaknesses, be it the training system or the maintenance system. And I think all too frequently our CAPAs are not bold enough in terms of when we do see these trends, we don't address the underlying system weakness, and we allow things to persist. And if we were to address it, we can unlock and unleash a lot of value. The third point that I'd like to raise, or recommendation, is around system ownership. Specifically, those elements that we focus on need to be owned by a subject matter expert within the firm. Well, just to pose another question, to the audience here, which is the most common warning letter finding? I think I've alluded to this already. And many of you who hopefully wouldn't recognize this but would and haven't seen this recently, but nevertheless, this is that finding that surfaces most often. In the review of warning letters from 13 to 17, which encompassed 170 warning letters, this particular finding surfaces over 30%, about 53 times, over 50 times, I should say. So it's very significant, pretty much an area of focus for all of us. So therefore, the recommendation is to assure that the PQS element ownership is clear. So as an example, the subject matter expert on investigations knows the corporate and site-level SOPs inside and out, understands the current health of the investigation system, CAPAs that are open, how long CAPAs are taken and move through the system, whether or not triage is being appropriately applied, these sorts of things, and is working with stakeholders to improve the system. A complex system in a large company with multiple sites, well, this is not an easy task, and many stakeholders are involved. But nevertheless, as I mentioned early on, the status quo isn't acceptable, and we need to be continually moving to improve the system. So that's the third recommendation I wanted to put forward, to empower the subsystem owners, to assure that they're on a pedestal, they know that they have ownership, and they do what's been described here on this slide. Fourth point is to manage the interfaces. What I mean by this, we have at the work group level the need to make sure that roles and responsibilities are clear. I think we could all appreciate, those of you that are close to plant operations can appreciate the need to have clarity between, say, work units and shifts, if you will. Clarity between functions, say maintenance and production. And importantly, as pointed out in Q10, clarity between the contract givers and the contract receivers. In other words, there's a lot of emphasis in Q10 on outsourced activities. So we need to assure that our quality agreements are very specific in terms of who's to do what. Where we want to be is in that upper box where you can see on the left the green box adjacent to the blue box. There's clarity of roles. Where you get further down and there's overlap, there's a lack of clarity. And where there isn't any overlap whatsoever and there isn't clarity, you run the risk of the ball getting dropped. I was in a company not long ago where, in reviewing some deviations specifically related to low assay results, the investigation, the OS, actually the investigation related to the low assay results pointed to a number of factors. However, it neglected to look at the stability data relative to that product. And the answer by the firm was, well, that stability data is held by our customer. We don't have access to it. Well, how can you possibly do a thorough job in your investigation if you don't have that piece of data to evaluate how your product trends over time from a stability standpoint? So that's an example where clarity was not in place and there's risk. The fifth recommendation and last recommendation I put forward is related to communication up and down within the organization. I mentioned escalation. Escalation systems must be in place, and largely they are in most companies. In other words, when things surface that are of serious nature, be it nonconformances as an example or complaints, these move through the organization and leadership is notified. What we fail to do in many companies is to push our performance indicators to the shop floor and assure that people are aware of how we're performing relative to the elements of the PQS. In doing this proactively, we gain the benefit of their ownership, their buy-in, and ultimately their involvement in solving problems. What's great about this document Q10 is that it's in many respects an excellent read for those of us in plant operations and running quality systems. The effectiveness, as it's stated in Q10, of a quality system is ultimately demonstrated at the site level. And that's a very important point to keep in mind. It's there where the rubber hits the road, and it's there where we can determine whether or not we truly are managing a robust system. So I'd like to, at this point, take a few questions. If you'd like to ask some questions, please do so via the chat feature. Before getting there, I just want to emphasize one last recommendation relative to the health of the PQS. When you look at our product pipeline today and you take a look at those 46 novel drugs that were approved by the FDA in 2017, many of them fall into the orphan category. Many of them are addressing very particular patient needs. And ultimately, many of them are biologics and very sophisticated. And when we think about what we're trying to do in our industry related to novel approaches of manufacturing, such as continuous manufacturing, parametric release, semi-continuous manufacturing, all these things only work when there's a super robust quality system behind them. So that when you're looking at the aspects of implementing things such as batch size changes that are more market-driven as opposed to driven by our equipment size, obviously working within the design space, you need to assure that your deviations, your changes, all these various systems are working to facilitate that kind of a proactive approach to implementing technology. So I wanted to highlight that last point is the health of our system needs to be super strong. So that concludes the webinar portion. I'd like to take some questions. And again, I appreciate everybody listening for these 30 minutes. I guess I'm out of time, but I would like to certainly at least take one or two questions. One is it better to have investigations performed by shop floor personnel or separate investigation teams? Thank you for this question. It's an excellent question. It really depends. And sadly, I think so many of our answers start with it depends. It depends on the nature of the investigation. Ultimately involving shop floor personnel in the investigation leads to often a better CAPA, and the implementation of a better CAPA often leads to a better analysis of root cause. Some investigations are very, very complex and require separate investigation teams. At NSF, when we work with companies that are looking to improve their systems, we see a combination whereby core people are trained up to have the skills for root cause analysis and be able to carry very sophisticated investigations to closure. However, it's so important to involve shop floor personnel and developing root cause and identifying CAPAs. So it really truly depends. But thank you for that question. Another question that surfaced is whether or not there's an element of the PQS that I frequently find inside companies to be weak. I would put forward as an example, when I do visit companies, I spend quite a bit of time looking at maintenance systems. And I find that where there are weaknesses in the maintenance programs in companies, often we're not proactively looking to design out and eliminate the source of error. And I think that's an opportunity for us to focus on that particular aspect of the quality system. It's not neglected at companies, but nevertheless, I can see a lot of room for improvement in that particular area. So thank you for that question on the weakest element that I see. The next question, and I want to respect the time, so this will be the last question. I found that companies seem confused about the differences between corrective and preventative actions. Well, CAPAs have been around now going on a good number of years, and we certainly, when we offer training and focus in this area, are clear about the difference between CAPA and preventative actions. I find that there is a bit of confusion, and companies that have embraced CAPA don't have that level of confusion, but there's room for improvement here. I personally try not to get too hung up about the distinction, because what we want to do is assure that we identify those actions that are going to put the ultimate root cause to bed, to rest, so that we don't see reoccurrence. So we're out of time. What we'll do is take a look at the questions that have been submitted, and we can reach back to you with specific answers. These slides will be available for you to come back to. This recording will be available. I want to thank you again for joining and wish you a great rest of your day, rest of your afternoon. Bye-bye.